There is a very quiet assumption that most people carry without ever saying it out loud, and that is the assumption that what truly matters must be something solid, something definable, something you can point to and say, there it is. We tend to trust what has shape. We feel reassured by form, by structure, by things that present themselves clearly and occupy space. A full schedule feels meaningful. A clear identity feels safe. A well-formed opinion feels powerful. And when there is nothing there, when a space opens up that cannot be named, we often interpret it as absence, as lack, as something gone wrong. Yet if you pause and notice the world outside of human intention, you see something curious. A bowl is not useful because of the clay that forms its walls, but because of the hollow it contains. A room is not lived in because of the walls themselves, but because of the open space between them. Even the sky, which appears as a vast nothingness, becomes the stage upon which every cloud, bird, and shifting color can appear. The non-human world seems remarkably unbothered by emptiness. It does not rush to fill it. It does not label it as failure. So perhaps what we call emptiness is not the opposite of power at all, but something closer to its source. Imagine music for a moment. Not the notes themselves, but the silence between them. Without that silence, sound becomes noise, an uninterrupted mass with no rhythm, no articulation. The pause is not an interruption of music. It is what allows music to exist as music. In the same way, form relies entirely on what is not form, and yet the human mind, trained to cling, treats these spaces as threats. We often approach life as though it were a task of constant filling. Filling time, filling meaning, filling the self. When a moment arrives that offers no clear content, no emotion we can name, no role we can perform, no direction we can explain, we become uneasy. We say we feel empty, as though something essential has drained away. But notice how quickly we reach for substitutes. We distract ourselves, define ourselves, label the feeling, analyze it, explain it. Anything to give shape to what refuses to be shaped. And this is where identity begins to stiffen. Because when emptiness appears, the sense of me feels momentarily unanchored. The usual reference points, preferences, stories, ambitions seem to lose their grip. The self, which is normally experienced as something solid and continuous, suddenly feels porous. So we rush to restore form. We say, this means I am lost, or this means something is missing, or this means I must fix something. In doing so, we turn a spacious experience into a problem. But consider another angle. What if emptiness is not an error in the system, but the system briefly revealing itself? What if the power of emptiness lies precisely in its refusal to cooperate with our habits of control? Form can be managed. It can be organized, compared, improved, defended. Emptiness cannot. It does not respond to effort. It does not reward tension. It simply remains open, quietly undoing the structures we lean on to feel secure. This is why emptiness can feel unsettling. Not because it is harmful, but because it does not confirm who we think we are. It does not reflect our self-image back to us. It does not say, yes, this is you. Instead, it offers no commentary at all. And in that silence, the mind begins to search for something to grab onto. Anxiety often emerges not from emptiness itself, but from the attempt to escape it, to resolve it into something recognizable. In everyday life, this shows up in very subtle ways. A pause in conversation that feels too long. A free afternoon that suddenly feels heavy. A transition between projects, relationships, or phases of life where nothing new has fully taken shape yet. We describe these moments as uncomfortable, awkward, or meaningless. But perhaps they are uncomfortable only because they do not play by the usual rules. They do not offer form quickly enough. Emptiness holds a peculiar kind of power because it exposes how dependent we are on structure for our sense of reality. It reveals how much of what we call meaning is assembled rather than discovered. And when that assembly pauses, even briefly, the illusion of solidity wavers. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, just enough to be noticed. And maybe that noticing is the point, not as a lesson, not as a revelation, but as a gentle interruption, a reminder that what appears empty is not necessarily empty at all. It may simply be the space in which everything else becomes possible. When emptiness lingers a little longer, the mind begins to behave differently around it. At first, there is curiosity, quiet, cautious, but that curiosity rarely lasts. Soon, the familiar impulse returns, to name what is happening, to frame it, to make it intelligible. We say, "This feels pointless," or "This feels like I'm stuck," or "This must mean I've lost direction." Notice how quickly emptiness is translated into a story about the self. The space itself is neutral, but the interpretation is not. And this is where the tension deepens, because emptiness does not argue with the story we project onto it. It does not correct us. It does not reassure us. It simply remains what it is: open, undefined, unresponsive. The mind, accustomed to feedback, begins to feel ignored. And from that sense of being unanswered, a subtle unease arises. Not panic, not despair, but a quiet restlessness. A sense that something should be happening, even if we cannot say what. Think again of non-human examples. A field in winter appears empty to someone expecting crops, but the field itself is not anxious about its appearance. It is not trying to look productive. Beneath what seems like nothing, processes continue that do not announce themselves. The human mistake is to assume that visibility equals value, that what cannot be seen, measured, or articulated must be lacking. Emptiness, from this perspective, looks like failure only because we measure it with the wrong tools. Form reassures us because it confirms continuity. It tells us, things are still in place. Emptiness interrupts that reassurance. It introduces a gap where certainty used to sit, and in that gap, the self feels exposed, not threatened by something external, but unsupported by its usual structures. Identity, after all, is largely a collection of patterns, ways of thinking, reacting, narrating. When emptiness appears, those patterns momentarily lose their reference points. This is why people often describe emptiness as heavy, even though it contains nothing. The weight comes not from the space itself, but from the effort to resist it, the effort to fill it prematurely, to restore form before the mind feels ready to be without it. We fill our calendars, our thoughts, our screens, not necessarily because we need to, but because emptiness leaves us face to face with a question we are not used to hearing. Who are you when nothing is being asked of you? And that question feels unsettling precisely because it has no immediate answer. There is no form to point to, no role to perform, no achievement to reference. The mind circles around this absence, trying to reconstruct itself, trying to reassert a sense of direction. But emptiness does not offer resistance. It allows the circling without participating in it, and in doing so, it quietly reveals how much of our sense of self depends on friction. Consider how often meaning is equated with activity. Work, progress, expression, output. When these slow down or pause, the experience is quickly labeled as emptiness. But perhaps what is being lost is not meaning itself, but the familiar signals that tell us we are moving. Emptiness strips those signals away, leaving experience unmarked. And unmarked experience feels dangerous to a mind that equates direction with value. This is where anxiety often finds its foothold, not as a dramatic emotion, but as a low-level hum, a background tension, a sense that time is being wasted, that life is slipping, that something important is not being addressed. But notice that this anxiety does not arise from emptiness alone. It arises from the demand that emptiness justify itself, that it explain what it is for, that it prove its worth in the language of form. Yet emptiness has no interest in explanation. It does not announce its purpose. It does not rush to become something else. And in that refusal, it holds a strange authority. It cannot be negotiated with. It cannot be optimized. It simply remains open, waiting not for action, but for perception to soften. In everyday moments, this might appear as a pause you don't know how to fill, a moment of stillness that feels awkward rather than peaceful, a stretch of time where nothing demands your attention, and instead of relief, you feel restless. These moments are often dismissed as unproductive, but perhaps they are only uncomfortable because they do not support the version of yourself you are used to maintaining. Emptiness, then, is not the absence of meaning, but the absence of prepackaged meaning. And that absence feels threatening only to a mind that insists on knowing in advance what something is supposed to be. When that insistence relaxes even slightly, the experience of emptiness begins to shift. Not into something else, but into itself, fully allowed. And here, without fanfare, the power of emptiness becomes clearer. Not as force, not as intensity, but as openness that cannot be reduced. A space that does not collapse under interpretation. A pause that does not rush toward resolution. As this openness persists, something subtle begins to happen, not outwardly, but in the way experience is registered. The mind, having exhausted its usual strategies for filling the space, starts to slow its insistence. Not because it has found an answer, but because the urgency to resolve the emptiness loses momentum. There is still space, still no clear form. But the sharp edge of discomfort softens, almost imperceptibly. And in that softening, perception shifts. What becomes noticeable then is how much effort was previously being used to maintain form, to hold together an image of continuity, to ensure that each moment led cleanly into the next with a sense of purpose. Emptiness interrupts that sequence. It does not replace it with something better or deeper. It simply breaks the expectation that experience must always arrive with instructions. This is often mistaken for disorientation, but disorientation implies that there is a correct orientation that has been lost. Emptiness does not suggest that. It offers no preferred direction at all, and that absence of direction is precisely what unsettles a mind trained to move toward outcomes. When there is nowhere in particular to go, movement itself begins to feel strange. Identity becomes especially sensitive here, because identity is built largely from remembered patterns and anticipated futures. I am someone who does this, or I am becoming someone who will do that. Emptiness suspends both memory and projection just enough to reveal their constructed nature. The past stops providing momentum. The future stops offering reassurance. What remains is experience without commentary. This is why emptiness is often confused with numbness. But numbness is a closing down. Emptiness is not closed. It is open without direction. It does not dull sensation. It removes the narrative that usually surrounds sensation. Without that narrative, experience feels unfamiliar, even though nothing dramatic has changed. In this unfamiliarity, control becomes an issue, or rather, the absence of it becomes visible. Form allows control. You can shape it, manage it, improve it. Emptiness cannot be held in that way. It does not respond to effort. Trying to control emptiness is like trying to grasp space with your hands. The harder you try, the more obvious the futility becomes. And this is where anxiety often intensifies briefly, not because emptiness is growing, but because resistance is being exposed. The mind notices that its usual tools are ineffective. Analysis, distraction, explanation, none of these dissolve the space. They simply pass through it. The realization that there is nothing to fix, nothing to solve, can feel destabilizing at first. Yet notice how ordinary this is in daily life. Waiting in line without checking a phone. Sitting alone after a conversation ends. Finishing a project and feeling a strange flatness rather than satisfaction. These are small encounters with emptiness, often dismissed or quickly covered over. But they reveal how tightly meaning has been linked to motion and feedback. When those are absent, the question arises quietly: is something wrong, Or is this simply unadorned experience? The discomfort does not come from the experience itself, but from the expectation that experience should always be adorned, that it should always carry a message, a lesson, a direction. Emptiness refuses to perform that role. It does not reassure the ego. It does not threaten it either. It simply does not acknowledge it. And in that non-acknowledgement, the ego's urgency begins to appear unnecessary. Not incorrect, not misguided, just unnecessary. Time behaves differently here as well. Without clear events to mark it, time feels suspended. Minutes stretch. Hours feel shapeless. This can be interpreted as boredom, but boredom itself is another attempt to assign form. Another label that says, this should be something else. Emptiness, again, does not agree or disagree. It remains open. And in that openness, something ordinary yet overlooked becomes visible. Experience does not require constant interpretation to exist. Meaning does not have to be extracted. Identity does not have to be affirmed. Life does not collapse when form pauses. In fact, it continues quite effortlessly. The power of emptiness lies in this effortlessness. Not as a state to achieve, but as a condition that reveals how much effort was being applied unnecessarily. When that effort relaxes not deliberately, not strategically, but simply because it has nothing to push against, the sense of strain begins to dissolve. Nothing dramatic replaces it. No insight arrives with fanfare, just a quiet recognition that the space was never hostile. It was simply unfamiliar. When emptiness is no longer treated as a problem to be solved, it begins to settle into the background of experience, much like silence does in a room. At first, silence can feel awkward, even oppressive. But once it is allowed, it stops demanding attention. It becomes a field rather than an object. And within that field, everything else appears more clearly, not because it has been improved, but because there is nothing competing with it. This is where the relationship between emptiness and form becomes less adversarial. Form is no longer seen as the enemy of space, nor space as the enemy of form. They begin to appear as mutually dependent. Form emerges, lingers, dissolves. Emptiness remains. Not as a void, but as the condition that allows appearance in the first place. Without space, there is no shape. Without silence, there is no sound. Without emptiness, form has nowhere to occur. In everyday life, this can be noticed in very simple ways. A conversation gains depth not from constant speaking, but from pauses that allow words to land. Work feels meaningful not only because of tasks completed, but because of the spaces between them where nothing is being demanded. Even loss, which often feels like emptiness imposed from the outside, carries this same structure. What is painful is not the space itself, but the way form once occupied it and now does not. The space remains. What has changed is our relationship to it. The mind, however, prefers continuity. It wants the next thing to arrive quickly, so that the gap does not have to be felt. But when the gap is allowed, something unexpected happens. The sense of urgency fades. Not because answers arrive, but because the demand for answers loses its grip. The emptiness that once felt heavy now feels neutral, even gentle. It does not push. It does not pull. This neutrality is often overlooked because it lacks drama. It does not announce itself as insight or understanding. It does not reorganize life. It simply sits quietly beneath experience, supporting it without comment. And in that quiet support, the pressure to define oneself relaxes. Identity becomes less of a task and more of a movement, appearing when needed, dissolving when not. There is a peculiar freedom in this, though it does not feel like freedom in the usual sense. It feels more like the absence of a burden you did not realize you were carrying. The burden of having to be something specific at all times. The burden of having to justify each moment with meaning. Emptiness does not remove these possibilities. It simply shows that they are optional. And so the power of emptiness is not in what it gives, but in what it does not demand. It does not ask for improvement. It does not ask for interpretation. It does not ask to be turned into something else. It allows form to come and go without attaching to it. And in that allowing, form becomes lighter, less rigid, less absolute. This does not mean that emptiness replaces form, or that life becomes blank or detached. Form continues exactly as it always has. Thoughts arise, emotions shift, days fill themselves with activity. The difference is subtle. The background no longer needs to be filled. The silence no longer needs to be broken. The space no longer needs to justify itself. When emptiness is seen this way, it stops being something to fear or avoid. Not because it has been reframed as positive, but because it has been allowed to be what it already is. A condition, a space, a quiet openness in which experience unfolds. And perhaps this is the soft shift worth noticing, that what we often call emptiness is not the absence of life, but the absence of unnecessary pressure. Not a void to escape, but a space that was always there, holding everything gently, without asking to be recognized.